It's a very strange feeling, really, because there is a war that is going on, but the people of Kyiv are very much about getting on with things and treating it as business as usual. So you see cars going around, you see shops open, you see people going about their daily business. And in many ways, that reflects what President Zelensky said exactly a year ago when the invasion was declared, when shells were falling and all the politicians came to shelter in an emergency parliament building. President Zelensky said to them, no, get back to your offices, let's carry on as usual, let's show the Russians that we are not scared, we are undaunted by what's going on, and that's very much the atmosphere right now. Now, of course, if you go to the front in the east, in the Donbass, it's a very different situation where, of course, there is a war of attrition which is still continuing. And that situation there in the Donbass is something that we were speaking with a soldier about yesterday. He described scenes that are very much akin to what we would all be familiar with from the First World War. A horrible situation. They need more ammunition is what they are saying. Let's bring in now for some more comment on the situation right now and, of course, get an insight into the state of mind of President Zelensky, one of his top advisors, who's called Alexander Rodnyansky. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us. On this particular day, what are your feelings? And then after that, what are the feelings of the president? Can you give us some insight?
Yes, well, it's been a year. It's hard to believe that it's been a year. It felt like one moment ever since it began. So life is divided between, what happened before and after. Nobody could have believed a year ago. Many people wouldn't have believed that this would have been the reality, but it is. So now we're in it. We've been resilient. We've been defending our country, and we've been very successful in doing it. So that's the name of the game ever since then.
Soldier we spoke to yesterday who comes fresh from Bakhmut from the fighting there said that basically ammunition is what is needed. How can you, in your role, try to sort of somehow get the West to sort of provide more of that ammunition that soldiers badly need?
First and foremost, we're grateful for the support that we've been getting, military support, economic support, and primarily the military things that you've been asking about. We've been getting all sorts of equipment, but we need more. We need every tool at our disposal, every tool that the world has invented for us to be able to get the job done sooner rather than later, because everybody has to understand, and this is what we've been doing to convince the public, the politics, our partners, the sooner we can be victorious, the less costly it's going to be economically and obviously in terms of lives lost. So we need to have every single possible instrument that is out there for us to be able to be effective.
And that has been a consistent call from President Zelensky since day one. You know the moment when he said, "Ya tut, I'm here," and wouldn't go into hiding. How significant was that, do you think?
It was very significant. It was a very strong signal at the time, and there was doubt all around, and there was just ambiguity about what would happen next, whether our leadership would, stay in place, whether it would be resilient and strong enough to sustain the pressure and obviously the Russian invasion. And President Zelensky came out saying, look, we're here, we're not going to go anywhere, we're going to defend our country, and we're going to be strong and we're going to be victorious. And he proved that he was right.
What is the difference in this conflict compared to, say, what happened in 2014? Why do you think there's been such a different response from the West, for instance?
That's a very interesting question. It's a complicated one to answer. I would say one of the reasons that the response has been different, and that this time it was unambiguous who was in the right and who was in the wrong, is that Ukraine had changed quite a bit. I mean, if you look back to 2014, when we toppled a corrupt and criminal government that was headed by Yanukovych and his cronies, it wasn't so clear to the world, who was really in the right and the wrong. Unfortunately, even though back then it was clear that Russia was in the wrong, no matter what. Now it's just so much more clear.
In terms of what happens next, of course, your specialist area is that of economics, reconstructing the country in that sense. Clearly there is so much damage that's been done. The estimate I saw was $138 billion worth of damage. You'd say it's a lot higher?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's various estimates. Some of the numbers came even from last summer. The World Bank estimated there was $350 billion worth of damages and economic costs, direct and indirect costs of the war. If you look at some other estimates, what it would cost, for all of Ukraine to be modernized and essentially repaired and reconstructed, it's double that amount. If you look at back to last summer. Now, a lot has passed since then. Some time has been gone, and obviously more destruction has happened. So now it's even more staggering. It's hard to get precise estimates, but these numbers are absolutely staggering.
And going back to what you were saying about corruption, it's one of the fears perhaps in some quarters that maybe that might be a problem in terms of what happens next in terms of the rebuilding. It's important really to clamp down on that.
Absolutely, and we've been very serious in terms of our attempts and our efforts to combat corruption, and you've seen more of that recently in the news. You saw several prominent cases where high officials were persecuted, have been detained even, and we're investigating corruption. We're taking that very seriously. We're making all sorts of progress in that dimension, in that area. We've established 5 institutions to combat corruption, various institutions that work in tandem. And so yes, I mean, Ukraine is not as free from corruption as Denmark is, of course, and that's not a secret. But we've been making progress, and we're nowhere near that point that we've been in 2014. So we've made some progress.
A war is going on. We're here in Kyiv, we're having a relatively calm time. We were talking about Bakhmut a bit earlier, where of course people aren't having a calm time. The Donbass, Kherson in the south, there are things happening on a day-to-day basis, Kharkiv as well.
Yeah.
Here in Kyiv today, schools, I understand, closed because of fear of a possible Russian missile strike. It's one thing to talk about relaunching the country, but when you still have that going on, it is incredibly difficult to plan.
Absolutely, and we still have to plan, we still have to start our recovery and reconstruction process somehow. And so the way we think about it is in phases, short term to medium term to long term. The short term phase is obviously, look, we need to the liberated areas, we need to get life going back. We need to rebuild the schools, rebuild the facilities, make sure that somehow life is resuscitated. Over the long run, obviously, that's after the war. We need to make sure that we get the investments, we have the institutions in place to guide the recovery and reconstruction efforts. And what we can do now is obviously shape those institutions, start preparing them, start, essentially building them up. And that's what we've been doing. And that's when the big sums of money, the big investment, that's when it's to be expected. Right now, we need a more limited amount to keep our government functioning.
Indeed, the G7 calling for more investment for Ukraine, more sanctions to be placed on Russia. Is that the right step, do you think?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, ultimately, the key to the end of this war lies in Russia, because that's where it originated. And what we need to do is we need to destabilize Russia. I mean, as frank as it sounds, but that's the truth. Because we need to get rid of this regime. We need to make sure that this regime does not have the facilities, the capabilities to focus on its foreign policy adventures as it sees fit. And that's what we need to do.
Emmanuel Macron says that it's never been, for instance, France's plan to ruin Russia, to defeat Russia, to crush Russia. It's not that situation. He says it never will be. But nonetheless, it sounds from what you're saying that there needs to be some kind of progression beyond just getting Russia out of Ukraine. Something else needs to be done.
Absolutely, because there is the eventuality, the possibility that even if we're going to be so successful in our counter-offensives that we liberate all of Ukraine proper, and there's no doubt where Crimea belongs as part of Ukraine, right? That if this regime continues to be there, remains intact, it's just going to keep bombarding us from its other borders, right? From our proper borders. So there's no guarantee that the war will end at that point. What will guarantee the end to the war is if we fundamentally change the Russian regime. And that's in the best interest of the Russian people themselves, because we need to put them on a development path that is more democratic somehow than what they've been on for the last 20 or however many years.
There have been a number of diplomatic developments. Obviously, Joe Biden coming to meet with Vladimir Zelensky. We've seen China's foreign minister go to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin. Zelensky responded to that by saying he'd welcome a meeting with China. Do you think there's anything to be developed on that line? Do you think that any kind of Chinese peace plan has any realistic way of working?
Look, I think one big conclusion from all of this, or one aspect that you can take away, is that the world is getting tired, and even China is getting frustrated internally with this war dragging out for so long. It's becoming costlier to everyone, including other countries like China. So we welcome that sort of impulse, but that doesn't mean that we welcome the actual suggestions yet, right? We have to look at the details. We know there's questions as far as China's involvement is concerned. More recently, those have become more prominent. We've seen question marks about weapon supplies, other forms of support. That would be a huge mistake on the part of any potential ally that Russia might have. Because look, you have to be on the right side of history here.
Alexander, there are people, 200,000 people, perhaps at one estimate, who a year ago, just over a year ago, were alive who are now dead. People who've been killed in this conflict. Do you understand how some people might say to you, look, let's get peace going in some way, shape or form. Let's just settle on what you have, except you're going to lose some land.
Look, we've heard this before, and the answer is very simple. That's not going to settle anything. It's going to freeze things, make things more costly, and worsen them in the medium to long run. Because the way Russia thinks about this currently with this regime is as follows. It thinks about it, as if you want, as in the 18th century with the partition of Poland, when Poland was erased from the map of the world. And that took about 30 years, right? It took several decades. So Russia right now doesn't face any internal pressures, right? The regime has crushed any sort of a position. It feels like it has all the time in the world, and it can take any amount of people, because it doesn't value human life, as we can see, to just send them here as cannon fodder and take as much time as they need to crush and erase Ukraine from the map of the earth, as happened with Poland in the 18th century. That's approximately the type of thinking that you have there. So you can't negotiate any sort of ceasefire or even go there, even if you wanted to. But that's a separate issue. For us, there's no question of where Crimea belongs. We have internationally recognized borders, and everybody recognizes those borders. So that's a whole separate issue.
You mentioned cannon fodder, that the idea of troops being just used to run at fire and die, basically dying to gain some ground. 790 Russians killed yesterday, which is a note from the Ukrainian armed forces. It is an astonishing figure, I think, for anybody to consider. Can I just move on now and ask you a final question about the year ahead? You're an advisor to the president of Ukraine. You're serving your country. Your thoughts, your words matter. What are your words to President Zelensky?
Look, I advise on financial and economic issues. My words are the same as all of our teams. I'm going to be here. There's no other place I want to be except for in my country, in Kyiv. I'm going to be doing everything I can that's in my capacity to help us be victorious. And we have to be successful economically, because everything holds together, everything at this point. The military aspect, the economic aspect. If something goes wrong, that's very bad news for us. So I'm going to be doing everything that I can.
Alexander Rodnyansky, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Presidential advisor to the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Here in Kyiv, as I was saying earlier, business as usual. It is a capital at war, but nonetheless, the people are carrying on with their lives. Back to you.
Thank you, Mark. Mark Owen reporting from Kyiv with that look inside how the Ukrainian leadership is thinking. For more, let's speak to our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons, standing by in Kramatorsk. Hello to you, Rob. You're about 30 kilometers from Bakhmut, which is a focus of fighting right now on the front lines. Tell us a little bit about what it's like where you are.
You're right, it's about 30 kilometers from Bakhmut and closer to other points along the front line, but that is where the heaviest fighting has been taking place in this war since early last summer. The Russians have made some progress, but it's been incremental and made at massive cost. And talking to the Ukrainians here, we've been chatting to soldiers since we arrived in Kramatorsk yesterday. The feeling that they have is that although the Russians are pressing their offensive even stronger now, they do have the capacity to resist. But one thing they do keep saying is that they need more weapons from the West. In particular, they need more armor, they need more tanks. Because if they can get those tanks, they feel that they can change their posture from a defensive one to an offensive one. They can go on a counter-offensive. And they'll be enormously encouraged, I'm sure, by the news coming from Poland today that the first German Leopard tanks, the Leopard 2s that they've been asking for, have been sent from Poland into Ukraine. It's a start. It's not something they can use to go on the offensive with immediately. But once they start getting more sizable numbers of those tanks, they can start thinking about using them in offensive to try and crack the Russian positions. But the feeling is unquestionably optimistic here, although, this is a town of a population, I think, of 180,000 before the war. At the very maximum, 60,000 people living here now. You don't see them on the streets very much. They come in and do a shop once a week or something like that. After 2 o'clock, you scarcely see any civilians on the streets. It's become a garrison town, essentially. Soldiers everywhere. Sometimes you see armor trundling through the town, but mostly it's soldiers in their own vehicles. And the life of the city has essentially bled away, apart from its role as a garrison town.
Rob, you've been covering this war in depth for France 24. One of the biggest challenges beyond actual fighting is keeping morale up. So when you've been meeting with some of these Ukrainian soldiers, what have they been telling you?
Well, it's the same with the soldiers as it is with the civilians. The message, is essentially that we just need to keep that support coming from the West. In a way, it's even more interesting to listen to the civilians because, they're sitting there dependent on their soldiers. They say they trust their soldiers. They're confident that the army is going to win. And they in a sense, they're used to this war. There was a moment that had to be crossed, I think, very early in the war when it was uncertain about how things would go. But I think after the first couple of months, once the Russians have pushed back from their attack on Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, that was the turning point. Then I think Ukrainians, whether they were the soldiers fighting or the civilians, there was a moment when they gained confidence and they understood that they could do this, that the armed forces were strong enough, that they were organized enough, that they are agile enough, and that the population was solid behind them. And ever since then, that sort of sense of national unity has grown. So talking to soldiers, they say, we are going to win this. One tank commander I spoke to said, every day that I talk to the people in my platoon, I say to them, one word essentially, I say, victory, victory, victory. That's what it's going to be. And he says, I keep drumming that into their heads every day. So essentially, I think that is it, especially for the soldiers. With the civilians, the feeling I get is that they're tired. Like everybody is tired here, but they're absolutely going to see this through.
All right, Rob, thank you very much. Rob Parsons reporting from Kramatorsk. And as he was saying, soldiers or civilians alike hammering home the point that the need for Western resources is urgent. Let's speak to our correspondent in Poland, Magdalena Hodownik, on the border. Hello to you, Magdalena. Some news coming out of Poland that I think will bring a smile to many Ukrainian soldiers. A tank delivery. Tell us more.
Yes, that's true. Today, the government of Poland announced that the tanks, the Leopard 2, that they have been awaited for a long time, finally arrived to Ukraine. This is what Prime Minister Morawiecki will announce as expected this afternoon in Kyiv, having a very unexpected visit to mark the anniversary of the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And this is, as I said, a very much awaited gift the Ukrainians were waiting for a long time.
Yeah, a long-awaited gift coming from Poland. Poland doing a lot of help for Ukrainians. Up to 8 million people scattered across the continent, but no country has even half as many refugees as Poland. Tell us about the efforts with the refugees in Poland and efforts like integration and more.
Well, for now in Poland, we have around 1.5 million refugees that came from Ukraine during this year only. Yesterday, as I checked the statistics, we had nearly 25,000 people that arrived from Ukraine to Poland. So we have to say that this is still an ongoing movement from Ukraine to Poland. And over this 1 year, we received over 10 million refugees, 10 million people coming from Ukraine to Poland. So those are the numbers. And of course, those people had to find homes, and happily, most of them did. Happily, most of them found jobs, but they are still in limbo. Most of them say they want to return home as soon as possible. But they know that with the ongoing war and conflict and still ongoing fights, this is not yet possible. So most of them, they wait in Poland for a green light to go home and go to their country.
And whether it's the refugees or Polish citizens, are there fears that as we're in year 2 of this war now, are there fears from people you've spoken to about possibly this war spilling over the border?
I think this fear was way more present before than it is at the moment, especially after Joe Biden's visit and reassurance of what was said during his time in Poland as well as in Kyiv, that NATO stands strongly with the NATO countries. They will protect NATO's soil and eastern flank, especially that are in this risk. I think also this showed the solidarity of the countries neighboring with Ukraine, and I think that today the fear of the war spreading is a little bit less present, but we never know. And what this is what people say. We never know what's in Vladimir Putin's mind. And as we know, he also gathers some military around the borders with Ukraine. So the risk is still there, and people have it in their mind. But they also felt very reassured by the recent visits and meetings, also of Bucharest 9.
All right, Magdalena, thank you very much. Magdalena Hodovnik reporting. Well, it is difficult to estimate the exact number of deaths and injuries since the beginning of the war. However, there is agreement that the actual numbers are a lot higher than the official figures. Take a look.
Funerals of soldiers killed in Ukraine have become a daily occurrence as the fighting rages on. Both sides have been secretive about their respective casualty numbers. Kyiv has claimed to have lost 13,000 soldiers, while in September, Moscow said it had lost 6,000 of its men. But in reality, Western intelligence estimates that around 100,000 Ukrainian and 200,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or injured since the beginning of the war.
The offensives are lasting months. Lots of soldiers have been launching suicide attacks. It's like going back to trenches of the First World War. Hundreds of people are dying every day.
Russia has been the worst hit. That's because they're on the offensive, but also because they've been using their men, and especially their Wagner mercenaries, as cannon fodder. This Ukrainian drone spotted Russians trying to hide. But then an explosion gave them no chance of survival.
40,000 prisoners were recruited in Russian prisons by Wagner. Only 10,000 of them are still fit for the front.
In 1 year, Russia has lost 10 times more men than it did over 10 years of war in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of civilians are thought to have died in the past year. Most of these deaths are believed to have occurred during massacres in cities like Bucha and Mariupol, where mass grave sites have been uncovered.
And Ukrainian investigators have been looking into allegations of war crimes, including those of a sexual nature. Our reporters Luke Shrego and Melina Uwe followed some of the psychologists on the ground.
Welcome to Casualties, a village about an hour northwest of Kyiv. Russian troops entered the area on March 20th, 2022 for about 10 days. Some of the scars of their occupation are obvious, but others below the surface, less so.
У вас є гінекологи, у вас є лікарі, так, але є я, психолог, і ви можете звернутися до мене.
The clinic continues to operate without power as Casualties residents pass by for checkups, an opportunity for aid groups to assess patients' mental states.
То у вас, ого, у вас така прям...
У нас, да. Ну, страшно, дуже страшно. Я не могла спать, я такая еще эмоциональная, впечатлительная, еще самолеты летают над головой.
А як спите?
Ну, иногда там успокоительное. Ну, вот я сегодня встала в 3 часа. Из 3 часов я не спала.
For psychologist Irina, moments like this are a chance to discover victims of sexual violence related to the war, or at least get word out that help is available.
Тут є телефон гарячої лінії, вона є анонімною. Можливо, є хтось, я би дуже просила, щоб ви передали, що в цьому немає нічого соромного, що це не їх провина, що з ними трапилося. Це провина, повинні відчувати сором ті, хто це робив, а не ті дівчата, які постраждали за це. Дякую.
Да, теж дякую.
Vasil heads up a Kyiv psychological and social aid center. On the ground, he tries not just to raise awareness with locals, but also investigate possible crimes of sexual violence.
Тебе листівки ще є? Є. Хорошо.
95% of the calls he gets are from Ukrainians who just need to talk things through.
А ми психологи з Києва.
У нас специфічна розмова.
Да.
Мені треба психіатр.
Психіатр, так, і психіатр також, в тому числі. А що у вас?
Я зараз вам скажу. Ви розумієте, оце во время війни я знала, що рашисти, що стріляють, що тут таке робили, і ще я стара, там, мені знаєте.
А хлопці і роздівали, наколки шукали, і на коліна ставили. І здівалися, хотіли. П'ють, ходять, п'ють. Оце до 9 вечора. Після 9 вечора ходять і стріляють. Є по чому, ну п'яні всі.
Якщо маєте потребу, телефонуйте. На все добре.
Щоб розплакатися, да наревіться, да.
І це також треба деколи. Плач також допомагає.
Vasil and Irina are currently helping 33 women. Since August, they've worked with around 1,500 under a program set up by the international group Women for Women.
Ну, як вам сказати, коли за допомогою автомату вказують напрямок руху, то приємного мало.
Psychological ground teams like Vasil and Irina's have a huge task ahead. After a year of war and months of Russian occupation that have scarred Ukraine's collective society, there are still all too many people in need of specialist help.